My father said the tower was too painful to open. He said it every time I asked, from the time I was 7 years old until I was 40. And in all those years, every single time, he never once said painful for whom. Cecily Brand was 67 years old when she finally stood at the base of it. The tower rose 40 feet above the eastern edge of the Mercer Hill Farm in upstate New York. Pale gray fieldstone built in 1887, still solid after more than a century of winters. The door was oak and iron, and it had 2 locks. The first lock was original, a mortise lock built into the door itself, the same year the tower was constructed. The second was a padlock, heavy modern by comparison, bolted to a steel hasp on the outside of the doorframe sometime in the 1960s. Someone had added it after the fact. Someone had locked this door from the outside and walked away and never come back. The tower had started as an observation post for the harvest, high enough to see every field on the property at once. At some point it became something else, a studio, a place to work, a place that belonged to one person in a way no other place on the farm did. It was locked in 1963, the year Evelyn Mercer died. For 60 years after that, the tower stood at the edge of every family gathering, every harvest season, every hard winter on that farm. Always there, always closed, always explained the same way whenever someone asked with words that answered nothing. The key to the padlock was found in Lawrence Mercer's Bible, tucked between pages 23 and 24 of the Book of Psalms, wrapped in a small piece of paper, tied with a thin piece of string. The handwriting on the paper was Lawrence's, careful, deliberate, the print of a man who had written the same way his entire life. He had written exactly 4 words about that tower in 60 years. When you are ready. And below that, a single initial, L. Cecily Brand had not planned to be the one who inherited Mercer Hill. She had not planned for it because she had not allowed herself to think about it. Her Aunt Ruth had lived on the property for 31 years. After Lawrence died, the last of that generation, the last person on earth who had known Evelyn Mercer as a living woman. When Ruth passed in February, Cecily drove up from her home outside of Albany, not as an heir, but as a niece who needed to handle arrangements. That was how she framed it to herself. Arrangements. A practical word for a practical woman. The will was simple. The attorney read it in 20 minutes. There were no special instructions, no conditions, no lists of who should receive which object. There was only one directive that mattered: the Mercer Hill property in its entirety passed to Cecily. Her aunt had not explained why. Cecily spent the first 3 days on the farm working through the main house room by room. She was methodical about it. She had always been methodical. 41 years as a botanist had given her a particular way of approaching unfamiliar environments. Start at the perimeter, work inward, do not form conclusions before you have examined the evidence. She cataloged what was there. She made notes. She did not rush. It was on the 3rd morning that she found it. Lawrence Mercer had kept a Bible on the study shelf for as long as anyone in the family could remember. It was large and dark-covered, the kind that doubled as a family record book, births and deaths and marriages written in the front pages in 4 generations of handwriting. Cecily had seen it on that shelf since she was a child. She lifted it down now to add it to the box of documents she was setting aside for closer review. She felt the thickness before she opened to the page. Psalms. Between pages 23 and 24, a small envelope. And inside the envelope a key, a padlock key worn smooth on the bow from handling, the kind of smooth that comes from being picked up and set down many times over many years. And around the key, wrapped and tied with a thin piece of string, a folded slip of paper. She unfolded it. The handwriting was Lawrence's. She recognized it immediately from the farm ledgers she had gone through in the barn office that first morning, the careful, upright print of a man who had learned to write in a one-room schoolhouse and had never changed his hand. He had pressed the pen with intention. Every letter was deliberate. The lines were straight without the help of ruled paper. 4 words, and a single initial below them. When you are ready, L. Cecily stood in the study and looked at what her grandfather had written. Lawrence Mercer had died in 1989. He had placed this key in this Bible and written these 4 words and left them there for 34 years, before Cecily found them. 34 years of family visits of holidays in this house of her father, sitting in the chair, in the corner of this study of her Aunt Ruth, dusting this shelf, and the key had stayed exactly where Lawrence had put it, waiting. He had not written when you want to know. He had not written when you are curious. He had not written open this when I am gone, or here is what I could not say. Just when you are ready. The patience in those 4 words was almost more than she could hold. She put the key in her pocket and walked to the tower. The morning was cool and clear, late March, the light coming low and flat across the farm from the east. The fields were still winter gray, the soil not yet turned. She walked the path along the fence line to the eastern edge of the property, where the land lifted slightly before evening out on the ridge, and the tower came into view, the way it always had, solid gray, unchanged, standing at the edge of everything, like a punctuation mark, at the end of a sentence she had never been allowed to finish reading. She stopped at the door and looked at the locks. She had looked at them before over the years, as a child, as a young woman bringing her own children to the farm for summers. She had looked at them the way you look at something that has always been explained away, with a kind of incurious acceptance, the looking without seeing that happens when an answer has been provided often enough that the question stops forming. Now she looked carefully. The original lock was a mortise lock built into the door itself, iron black, with age, the kind of hardware made to last a century, and which had. The keyhole was large and simply shaped. This lock had been here since 1887. It was part of the door. The padlock was different. It was heavier than the original lock, more modern. The hasp it hung from had been bolted to the door frame with 4 screws, the wood around them slightly raised and darker than the surrounding surface in the way wood looks when hardware has been added after the fact. This was not original construction. This had been installed later, sometime in the 1960s, she estimated, based on the style and the condition of the metal. Someone had added a second lock to a door that already had one. Someone had locked this door from the outside. Cecily stood at the threshold and thought about that. The original mortise lock could be operated from either side. From inside the tower, you could turn the mechanism and lock yourself in. From outside, you could use a key and lock it after you left. Standard construction. The padlock could only be locked from the outside. Whoever had added it had stood exactly where Cecily was standing now, on the outside of the door, and locked it. And left. 2 locks? 2 decisions. 2 different people, or 2 different moments, or both. She tried the padlock key. It turned on the first attempt. She removed the padlock and set it on the ground. Then she tried the original lock. The large iron key from the ring in her father's study, the one she had never been able to identify, labeled "Only Tower," the one she had slipped into her pocket without quite knowing why that morning. She fitted into the mortise lock. The mechanism turned smoothly. She stopped. The original lock had not been locked. She tried again, just to be certain. The key moved freely in both directions. No resistance, no locking mechanism engaged. The original lock had been left open, which meant whoever had sealed this tower had used only the padlock added from the outside, the one that required a separate key, the one Lawrence had wrapped in paper and placed in his Bible, with a note addressed to no one and to everyone and to whoever arrived when they were ready. The original lock had never been engaged. The door had been waiting to be opened for 60 years, held shut by one lock that anyone could have removed with the right key, which had been sitting 30 yards away in a Bible on a study shelf. Cecily put her hand on the iron handle of the door and pushed. It opened inward slowly, without resistance, without the groan of rotted wood or the resistance of swollen frames. The hinges were dry, but they held. The door was heavier than she expected, solid oak built for a century of weather, and it had managed exactly that. She had expected the smell of abandonment. Damp stone mold, the particular sourness of a sealed space that had been wet and dry and wet again over 60 years of upstate winters. That was not what she smelled. The smell was faint, dry, preserved by stone that had held the temperature stable through every season. She stood at the threshold and breathed it in and searched for the word. Linseed oil. Old linseed oil, the kind used to thin oil paint and condition brushes and treat the wood of canvas stretchers. Faint after 60 years, but unmistakable to anyone who knew it. It did not smell like abandonment. It did not smell like something forgotten. It smelled like a studio where someone had been working. If you have ever stood in a place and felt that the walls remembered something the people had not told you, stay with us. Because everything inside this tower had been waiting a very long time to be found by the right person. The staircase was iron and oak open on both sides, spiraling upward through the center of the tower, with no wall to lean against and no railing high enough to feel like safety. Cecily put her hand on the outer edge where the iron met the stone wall and began to climb. She moved slowly. Not from caution about the structure, she had tested each step before committing her weight, and the iron was solid, bolted into the stone with hardware that had outlasted everything else on the property. She moved slowly because she was looking. This was the habit that had defined her professional life. 41 years of field work had trained her to treat every unfamiliar environment the same way: observe before you interpret, record before you conclude. Let the space tell you what it is before you decide what it means. The first landing was barely a landing, a slight widening of the staircase where the iron platform was large enough to stand on without continuing upward. On the wall above it at eye height, a single nail had been driven into the mortar between two stones. On the nail, a cloth. She stopped and examined it without touching. It was a paint rag canvas or heavy cotton, she could not tell in the flashlight, but thickened and stiffened by use the way rags look when they have absorbed layer after layer of oil paint over years of wiping brushes. The colors in it were not random. There was a logic to the layering she could see even in the narrow light. Browns and ochres on one end, blues and grays on the other, as if someone had used different ends of the cloth for different palettes, and done so consistently enough that the separation held. A person who uses a rag the same way every time they work is a person who has been working for a long time. She noted it in the small notebook she had carried in her coat pocket since her first year of graduate school and continued up. The second landing held a jar. It was a glass jar, wide-mouthed, the kind originally used for preserves, repurposed as a brush holder. There were 7 brushes in it, stored bristle up the correct way to store brushes you intend to use again, so the bristles keep their shape, so the ferrule does not collect moisture. Several of them were stiff, the bristles spread and dried at whatever angle they had last been used, but 3 were still soft. She could see the quality of them even through the glass. These were not cheap brushes. Someone had bought good tools and cared for them and then left them here mid-arrangement as if they had stepped away and would be back. She continued up. The third and final landing before the top room held something she nearly missed: a palette knife, the long, thin kind used for mixing color on a palette board, lying in the slight depression between 2 stones where the mortar had receded. It was broken at the midpoint of the blade, a clean break, the kind that happens when the metal fatigues from years of bending, and one bend finally exceeds what the material can hold. The break was old. The 2 halves lay where they had been dropped. No one had picked them up. Cecily photographed it with her phone. A broken palette knife on a staircase landing, a working cloth on a nail, a jar of brushes stored with intention. This tower had not been a place where someone kept their supplies. It had been a place where someone worked, repeatedly, seriously, with the particular organization of a person who knows exactly where everything is, because they have put everything in its place hundreds of times before. She came up through the opening in the floor into the upper room. The space was circular, approximately 12 feet across, with walls of the same pale fieldstone as the exterior. The ceiling was low compared to the height she had been climbing. The tower narrowed slightly toward the top, and the upper room had been built within that narrowing. 2 windows set across from each other in the curved wall looked out over the farm, one to the north, one to the south. The glass in the north window was still intact, thick and slightly wavy with age, the kind of glass that had been made before the process was standardized. The south window had lost its glass at some point and been covered with a board nailed from outside. The light in the room came from the north window. It was morning light coming low across the fields, and it fell through the old glass and landed on the surface of the work table, in the particular way that north light falls, even without direct sun, without shadow from a moving source, the kind of light that painters have sought for centuries because it does not lie about color. Cecily stood at the top of the stairs and let her eyes move through the room before she stepped forward. The work table was along the curved wall to the right of the north window. It was a plain farm table, heavy pine, its surface stained with rings from jars and cans and the accumulated marks of years of use. On it a palette board, hardened the colors in their last arrangement dried to permanence. A coffee can holding 3 more brushes. A folded cloth placed over the edge of the table with the precision of someone who would need it again shortly. On the wall beside the table, a wooden shelf had been built directly into the stone, set into a recess as if planned for from the beginning. On the shelf, 3 flat wooden boxes, the kind used to transport paintings, each roughly the size of a large book. A glass bottle, empty its label, faded to illegibility, and a metal box perhaps 10 inches long and 6 inches wide, with a lid that closed on a small clasp. Around the clasp, a piece of thin cord had been wound several times and tied, and pressed into the knot of the cord a small circle of dark wax hardened, sealing the tie without preventing it from being undone. Someone had closed this box with the intention that it stay closed. Not locked, there was no lock, but sealed in the deliberate way of a person who wanted the act of opening it to require a conscious decision. Cecily looked at it and did not touch it yet. In the center of the room, on the wide pine boards of the floor, was the easel. It was a large studio easel, the kind built for serious work, adjustable in height and angle, constructed from hardwood darkened now with age and marked at every joint and rung with the paint of years. It had been positioned with care, angled toward the north window to receive the light at the optimal angle for seeing color accurately. On it, still mounted, still positioned as it had been left, was a canvas. She crossed the room to stand in front of it. The painting was large, she estimated 30 inches by 40, perhaps larger. An upstate landscape, fall the farm fields from above, and to the east, the long line of the ridge, in the distance the woodline dark at the horizon. The light in the painting was the light of a late October in this part of New York, low golden, coming from the south at a precise angle that told her the painter had observed this view at a specific time of day and had been accurate about it. The painting was unfinished. The lower left quarter of the canvas was bare. The pencil underdrawing was still visible on the gessoed linen, the structural lines for what would have been the foreground, a suggestion of the near field, the edge of a fence. The brushwork at the boundary of the finished and unfinished sections was slightly rough at the edge, the mark of a brush that had been running low on paint when the painter stopped intending to reload and return. She had not returned. Cecily stood in front of the painting for a long time. She was not thinking about what it was worth. She was not thinking about what it meant for the family or the property or the history she was standing in the middle of. She was thinking about what it felt like to look at it. And what it felt like was the feeling of being shown something true. This was not decorative work. This was not a hobby pursued pleasantly on quiet afternoons. The painter had understood the light. The painter had understood the structure of the land. The painter had made decisions in every inch of this canvas that required knowledge and practice and the particular intelligence that comes only from having done something seriously for a long time. She turned back to the shelf. She picked up the metal box. It was heavier than its size suggested. She carried it to the work table and set it down under the north window in the best light available. She looked at the wax seal. The wax was dark red, plain, no mark or initial pressed into it. She worked the cord loose, carefully preserving the seal intact as she unwound the tie. Then she opened the clasp. Inside the box, folded and stacked in careful order, were letters. She lifted the top one. The envelope had been opened, slit cleanly along the top, preserved after reading. The letterhead on the paper inside was printed in clean dark type at the top of the page. Hatcher & Sons Fine Art, Albany, New York. She looked at the addressee line. E.L.M. Mercer Hill, Dutchess County. She unfolded the letter and read the date first. March 1949. Then she read the body of it. Dear E.L.M., We are pleased to confirm the sale of Autumn Field Series 1 to Mr. Frederick Denholm of Saratoga Springs at the agreed price of $180. Payment will be remitted by bank draft within 10 days of this letter. We look forward to receiving your next submission and remain as always grateful for the quality of your work. Cecily set the letter down on the surface of the work table. She looked at the unfinished painting on the easel. Then she looked back at the letter. Then she looked at the stack of envelopes still in the box. Hatcher and Sons had been grateful, had expected another submission, had been receiving work from ELM of Mercer Hill for long enough to write as always in a sentence about quality. The woman who had climbed these stairs every working day, who had hung her rags on nails and stored her good brushes bristle up and broken one palette knife and replaced it with another, and positioned her easel to catch the north light correctly and left a canvas unfinished in October of 1963. That woman had been selling her work, and someone at a gallery in Albany had known her name. The rest of the letters were still in the box. Cecily did not move from the work table for a long time after reading the first letter. She read it a third time. Then she set it aside and opened the next envelope. She worked through them in order the way she had been trained to work through field data chronologically, without skipping ahead, without allowing the later entries to color how she read the earlier ones. Each envelope slit cleanly at the top. Each letter unfolded carefully and laid flat on the work table surface in sequence. The north light came through the old glass and lay evenly across each page as she read it. The letters were from 6 galleries: Hatcher and Sons in Albany, the Regional Arts Cooperative on State Street, a smaller operation called Birchwood Gallery in Saratoga Springs, 2 others she did not recognize, and one from Burlington, Vermont, a gallery called Champlain Fine Art, with a letter that was more formal in tone than the others, the kind of formality that signals a newer relationship still finding its register. 14 of the 23 letters confirmed sales. The others were correspondence inquiries about availability, confirmations of receipt of new work, one letter discussing framing preferences, one asking whether ELM would consider a group exhibition in the spring. That last letter was dated September 1962. There was no reply in the box. When she had read all 23, Cecily took out her notebook and wrote down the numbers. She listed each confirmed sale by date, by gallery, by title, where the title had been given, and by amount. The figures were in dollars, always the full amount, no indication of a gallery commission having been deducted, though presumably one had been. When she had listed all 14 sales, she added the column, $4,280. She wrote the number on a separate line and looked at it. In 1948, the year of the first confirmed sale, $4,000 was the cost of a new tractor. It was close to 2 years of operating expenses on a farm the size of Mercer Hill. It was not a small number. It was not the accumulation of a hobby. It was a sum that required sustained output over 15 years, multiple gallery relationships, and the kind of consistent quality that kept buyers returning and galleries writing as always when they described their gratitude. She capped her pen and looked at the stack of letters. Then she looked at the shelf. She had noted the notebook earlier, one of 3 items on the built-in shelf beside the work table tucked between the flat wooden transport boxes. She had left it for after the letters. Now she crossed to the shelf and lifted it down. It was a standard composition notebook, the kind sold at any general store. The cover was dark green, stained at the corner from something that had dripped and dried years ago. The spine was intact. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was not Lawrence's. She had spent 3 days going through the farm's records, and she knew Lawrence's hand, the careful, upright print of a man who had learned to write in a one-room schoolhouse. This was different, smaller, more fluid. The letters connected in the way of someone who had learned a cursive hand and kept it into adulthood when most people let it go. The ink was dark where the pen had pressed and lighter where it lifted the particular variation of someone who wrote with attention. The notebook was organized in columns. Left column dates, center column amounts received, right column a notation always brief, always specific. She read the first entry, October 1948, $140. F. August corn seed. She read the next. March 1950, $95. L. September tractor repair. She stood at the work table and read every entry in the notebook. The logic of it assembled itself entry by entry, line by line, the way a pattern reveals itself in field data when you have enough of it. Each sale corresponded to a farm expense. Each notation named the expense precisely, not categories, not approximations. East barn roof, April. Well pump, October. Seed corn for the lower field, August. The property tax shortfall. November 1954, which Cecily happened to know from the farm ledgers, had been a particularly difficult year. Evelyn had not been keeping an artist's accounts. She had been keeping the farm's accounts, the other half of them. The half that did not appear in Lawrence's ledger because Lawrence did not know it existed. When the farm's income from crops and livestock fell short of what the year required, and in the decade after the war, in the lean years of the early 1950s, in the dry summer of 1957, it fell short. Often Evelyn had climbed these stairs. She had worked. She had sold what she made to galleries that did not know her name, only her initials. And she had taken the money back down the stairs and paid for whatever the farm needed that Lawrence could not cover. She had done this 15 times over 15 years. She had done it in silence. Cecily sat down on the floor of the tower room with the notebook in her lap and looked at the unfinished painting on the easel across from her. She was a scientist. She had spent her career in the discipline of not projecting meaning onto data, of letting evidence speak in its own terms before she offered interpretation. She had been good at that discipline for 41 years. She was not good at it now, because what she was looking at was not a secret in the way that word usually applied to family histories. It was not a shame kept hidden. It was not a wrong concealed. It was something more precise and more difficult than that. It was care. Care designed with the specific intention that the person being cared for would not feel the weight of being cared for. Evelyn had used her initials instead of her name. She had chosen galleries in Albany, not New York City, close enough to be practical, far enough that the buyers would not be neighbors who might mention a purchase to Lawrence at the feed store. She had never sold through a single gallery often enough to become notable. She had kept her prices in the range that sold without attracting attention. She had been methodical about remaining invisible. She had built a 15-year system of care and built into that system at every point a protection for Lawrence's sense of himself as the man holding the farm together, because he was. That was the thing Cecily kept returning to as she sat on the floor of the tower. Lawrence had been holding the farm together. His labor, his knowledge of the land, his stubbornness through bad years, all of that was real. All of that had mattered. Evelyn had not been compensating for a man who was failing. She had been supplementing a man who was succeeding at something hard in years, when succeeding at something hard was still sometimes not enough. Both things had been true at the same time. Cecily turned to the last page of the notebook with entries. The date was January 1963. 2 months before Evelyn died. The entry was different from the others. There was no amount listed, no farm expense in the right column, just a notation longer than any other in the book, written in the same careful cursive hand, the ink slightly uneven as if the pen had been pressed with more weight than usual. She read it. Balance remaining $340. L does not know. He must not feel this was charity. It was never charity. It is the same work, only different hands. Cecily read it twice. Then she closed the notebook and held it in both hands and sat in the north light, coming through the old glass, and did not say anything for a long time. L does not know. Lawrence had placed the key in his Bible. He had written "when you are ready" and left it there for 34 years. He had locked this door from the outside and kept the key and never spoken of it. Had he known? Had he always known? Cecily had been looking at the easel since she first came through the opening in the floor. She had looked at it the way you look at something you are not yet ready to approach peripherally, with awareness but without commitment, letting it stay at the edge of your attention while you worked through everything else. The letters, the notebook, the numbers in the margins of her own notes, the last entry in January 1963 with its careful cursive and its weight. Only now did she cross the room to stand directly in front of it. The canvas was covered. A piece of linen plain and unbleached draped over the front of the painting and tucked behind the frame at the bottom to keep it from slipping. It had been placed there deliberately, not thrown over in haste, tucked, smooth, the kind of covering you put over work you intend to return to. The linen had stiffened with time but held its drape. It had been doing its job for 60 years. Cecily took the bottom edge of the linen in both hands and lifted it. She drew it back slowly and draped it over the top of the easel frame and stepped back. The painting was large. She had estimated 30 inches by 40 when she first saw it, and she had been close. It was perhaps 32 by 42, painted on linen stretched over a wooden frame. The linen itself, a warm, natural color that showed in the unpainted lower left corner where the work had not yet been completed. Mercer Hill in November. She did not know the title yet. She would find it later written in pencil on the back of the stretcher frame in Evelyn's hand. But she understood it immediately before she found the title because she was standing in the place where this painting had been made and looking at a view she had known her entire life. The farm in late fall. The lower fields after harvest the soil turned, and resting the particular gray-brown of upstate New York earth in November, when the growing season has ended and the ground is settling into winter. The stone walls that divided the field's walls, built by generations of Mercers clearing the land, each stone placed by hand, running in their slightly irregular lines across the composition. The sky above them, the specific gray of November clouds in the Hudson Valley, not stormy, not dramatic, just the heavy, quiet gray of a season turning toward cold. And in the far distance, small in the frame, barely 3 inches of canvas, but unmistakable in his proportion and his posture and the particular angle of his shoulders, a man walking toward the barn. Cecily stood very still. She had photographs of Lawrence Mercer. She had grown up with those photographs. She knew the way he held himself, the slight forward lean of a man who had worked physical labor all his life, and whose body had settled into the posture of that work, the shoulders that did not square back the way a younger man's might, but carried forward useful, purposeful. She knew the way he walked because her father had walked the same way, and she had understood even as a child that it was inherited. The figure in the painting was 3 inches tall and painted in the loose, assured brushwork of the middle distance. But it was him. There was no question. Evelyn had painted her husband from 40 feet above and across 400 yards of November field, and she had caught him exactly. This was not a painting of a farm. This was a painting of a man placed in his landscape, seen from a great height, seen from a distance, seen with the particular attention of someone who has watched the same person move through the same space for many years and knows every angle of them. Cecily brought the stool from beside the work table and set it in front of the easel and sat down. She sat with the painting for a long time. She was not analyzing. She was not assessing. She was simply in the presence of it. In the presence of what it meant that Evelyn had climbed these stairs on a November day in the early 1960s and looked out the north window at her husband crossing the lower field, and had understood that this was worth painting. Not the dramatic light, not the picturesque landscape, just this man in this place doing the work he had always done, seen from above, seen from a distance, seen with love. The unfinished corner did not feel like abandonment. It felt like interruption. The painting was not incomplete because Evelyn had given up. It was incomplete because she had not come back. Cecily sat with that for a while. Then she stood and began to examine the easel more carefully. She was looking for nothing in particular. She had learned in fieldwork that the most useful observations were often the ones made without an objective, the undirected looking that lets you notice what a directed search would miss. She examined the frame of the easel, the adjustment mechanisms, the paint marks at every joint. And then she saw it, caught in the narrow gap between the side rail of the easel and the edge of the canvas frame, tucked into the space, as if it had been placed there intentionally and then pressed flat by the slight contact between the two surfaces over 60 years, a folded piece of paper. She worked it free carefully, using the edge of her thumbnail, applying no more pressure than necessary. It was a single sheet folded twice to a small rectangle. The paper was the same stock as the composition notebook, plain slightly cream-colored, the kind available at any general store in the 1960s. She unfolded it. The handwriting was Evelyn's. She knew it now from the notebook, from the careful cursive that connected its letters and pressed with intention. This was the same hand, but the writing here was slightly different in character. Not hurried, not agitated, but unguarded in a way the notebook entries were not. The notebook had been record-keeping. This was something else. She read it. I have been working up here for 15 years, and you have never once asked me what I am doing. I think you know the way you know everything quietly without saying it out loud. If I am wrong, and you have never known the farm is ours because we both worked for it. I just worked from up here. Cecily stood at the work table and read it twice. Then she read it a third time slowly and stopped at the middle sentence. The way you know everything quietly without saying it out loud. Evelyn had written this letter in the understanding that she might be wrong about Lawrence. She had acknowledged the possibility that he did not know. She had written an explanation for that possibility, a complete and sufficient explanation, one that gave him everything he needed to understand what she had been doing and why. And then she had written it in the full expectation that the explanation might be unnecessary, because she thought she knew him, because she believed he already knew the way he knew things, without asking, without announcing, without making a person feel observed. She had been writing to a man she understood. The intimacy of that was almost more than Cecily could process standing upright. To know someone well enough to write a letter that covers both possibilities that they knew all along and that they never knew, and to do it without accusation in either direction. Just this is what happened. This is why. We are equal in this. The farm is ours because we both worked for it. I just worked from up here. Cecily turned the paper over. The reverse side was blank. She looked at the fold lines. The paper had been folded and unfolded before. The crease at the first fold was not a single clean crease, it was slightly doubled, the way paper looks when it has been folded, opened, and folded again. The paper had been read at least once before it had been folded to its current shape and pressed into the gap beside the canvas. Someone had opened this letter and read it. Evelyn had written it. Evelyn had read it back. Evelyn had folded it again and tucked it into the easel beside the unfinished painting and gone back downstairs. She had not given it to Lawrence. She had kept it here in this room, in the space where she worked beside the painting of his back, moving across the November field. Maybe she had intended to give it to him and had not found the moment. Maybe she had decided it was not necessary, that she had been right, that he already knew that the letter was redundant. Maybe she had simply run out of time. She died in March 1963. The painting was fall. She had climbed these stairs in November of some year in the early 1960s and painted her husband crossing the lower field and written him a letter she never delivered. And Lawrence had locked the door and put the key in his Bible and written, "When you are ready." Cecily set the letter down on the work table beside the open notebook. The two documents lay side by side in the north light, the same handwriting on both, the same careful cursive, the same woman keeping two different kinds of record in the same room for the same man across 15 years of quiet mornings and sold paintings and farm expenses paid from a metal box. If you have ever loved someone quietly, the way that asks nothing back and leaves no record except the ones they find, later tell us in the comments whether you think Lawrence knew. Because Cecily was standing in the room with every piece of evidence available to her, and she still could not be certain. Cecily came down from the tower at 11:30. She stood in the yard with the metal box under one arm and the composition notebook in her coat pocket, and looked across the fence line toward the Briggs property. The farmhouse was visible from where she stood, a white clapboard house, set back from the road, smoke from the chimney, a truck in the drive that she recognized from the years when she had brought her children up here in summers, and Owen Briggs had been the neighbor who fixed the fence posts when they leaned and never mentioned being thanked. She had known Owen her entire life, the way you know people who have always been there without examining the fact of them, without asking what they had seen before you arrived to see things alongside them. He was 74 years old. He had lived on this property since birth. He had been 7 or 8 years old when Evelyn Mercer was still alive and working in the tower above the eastern field. She called ahead from the yard. He picked up on the third ring and told her to come over. Owen Briggs answered the door before she knocked the way people do when they have been watching out the window since the phone call. He was a tall man, gone slightly stooped with age, with the particular weathered quality of someone who had spent most of his life outdoors without thinking much about it. He looked at the metal box under her arm and at her face, and said nothing except come in and gestured toward the kitchen table. She set the box and the notebook on the table between them and sat down. She asked him what he remembered about Evelyn Mercer. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the surface of the table, the way people look when they are searching a memory they have not accessed in a long time and are not certain what condition they will find it in. "Dark-haired woman," he said finally. "Always came in through the back. I remember that because my mother used the front door for everyone, and I thought it was interesting that Mrs. Mercer preferred the back. I was maybe 7, 8 years old. Children notice things like that. Who uses which door?" Cecily asked him about the tower. Owen looked up. "The trucks," he said. "I was going to ask you what you found up there before you asked me anything else, but I suppose this is the right order." He folded his hands on the table. "Small trucks," he said. "Not farm trucks. We all knew the farm trucks by sight and sound. By the time we were 5 years old, you grew up knowing whose equipment was whose. These were smaller. Cargo vans, the kind used for deliveries in town. They came maybe 2-3 times a year. My mother said it was art supplies. I accepted that." He paused. "But what I remember, and I have thought about this once or twice over the years without ever having a reason to think harder about it, is that the things going out were wrapped in brown paper. Flat. The shape of them. Not things coming in, things going out. And they went out through the side door of the tower, not the main house. Whoever drove those trucks turned off before the main gate and came up the side path. You could see it from our yard if you were paying attention. I was a child. I was paying attention to everything." Cecily opened the metal box. She laid the letters on the table in order, not all 23, but the 14 that confirmed sales. She set the composition notebook beside them and opened it to the first page of entries. She let Owen look without explaining. He read slowly. His index finger moved along the lines of Evelyn's handwriting, tracking the columns the way someone reads who learned to read when reading was not taken for granted. His expression did not change dramatically. It was the expression of a man absorbing information that reorders something he had held a certain way for a long time. "Mrs. Mercer," he said finally. He said it the way you say a name when you are revising your understanding of the person it belongs to. "I always thought she was just the farm wife." He stopped. "No offense in that is what we thought then. Farm wife meant something specific, and it meant it completely, and nobody questioned what was inside it or outside it." He looked at the letters again. "Albany Galleries," he said. "Burlington." She was working with people in Burlington. He set the last letter down. Cecily asked him if he remembered anything else, anything Lawrence had said about those years, about the farm, about Evelyn. Owen sat back in his chair. He was quiet long enough that Cecily thought he might not have anything more to offer. Then he said there was a phrase he used. Lawrence, in the good years. When a crop came in well, or when something that had been threatening to go wrong went right, he would say it in that particular way of his, not boastful, just noting a fact. "Evelyn's prayers are working." Cecily looked at him. "I heard him say it maybe 4 or 5 times over the years," Owen said. "After she died, he never said it again, not once. I thought it was just something farmers say, attributing good fortune to something they cannot control. A wife's prayers, the weather, God's disposition. You grow up around farmers and you hear that language." He looked at the composition notebook still open on the table between them. "But those years he said it," Owen said. Would those be the years in the notebook? Cecily looked at the entries. 1952, a good harvest year. 1955, 1958. The years Lawrence had said it. She checked each one against the notebook. Each one had an entry. Each one had a sale. Each one had a notation in Evelyn's careful cursive seed corn for the lower field equipment repair the east barn roof. The years Lawrence called the years of Evelyn's prayers were the years Evelyn had sold paintings. Owen looked out the kitchen window toward the Mercer Hill property. From where they sat, the eastern edge of the farm, was visible the fence line, the slight rise of the land, and above the rise, just clearing the tree line, the top of the stone tower. He said your father told me once years ago not to ask about the tower. He said it quietly, the way he said things he meant seriously. I did not ask again. Cecily absorbed that. Frank had known, or had suspected enough to protect whatever was inside the knowing. She thought about her father, his particular silence, his care for the reputation of people he loved, his way of guarding things by simply not discussing them. He had said the tower was too painful to open. He had not said painful for whom or why or what kind of pain. Maybe he had not known exactly. Maybe he had known enough. Owen pushed back his chair and stood and looked out the window more directly toward the tower. That side door, he said. The door on the east side of the tower, the one that faces the side path instead of the main yard. You know the one. Cecily said she did. Owen said whoever drove those trucks up the side path, they would not have been visible from the main house. Not unless someone came outside and walked around. The angle is wrong. The barn blocks the sight line. He gestured, slightly indicating the geometry. You would have to know to look. Or you would have to be standing in our yard, which I was because I was 8 years old, and I went outside every time I heard a truck I did not recognize. Cecily looked at the side door from where she sat. She thought about the placement of it. The tower had been built in 1887 as an observation post. The main door faced the farmyard, as you would expect, but the side door lower, narrower set into the eastern face of the tower, opened directly onto the path that ran along the fence line to the road, a path used for field access, a path that any vehicle could take without passing the main house. She thought about Evelyn choosing which gallery to work with, choosing Albany over New York, choosing buyers in Saratoga Springs and Burlington rather than locally, choosing to sign only her initials, and she thought about Evelyn using the side door, not the main door, not the door that faced the farmyard where Lawrence might look out any window and see a van loading flat brown packages. The side door, the one with the angle that blocked the sight line, the one that a child across the fence could see from the yard but that no one inside the house would notice unless they already knew to look. This had not been accidental. Evelyn had not simply worked in the tower that happened to be there. She had understood the geometry of the property and used it. She had arranged the logistics of 15 years of sales, the galleries, the initials, the timing, the delivery route with the same methodical attention she had brought to the accounting notebook. Every element of her operation had been designed with a single objective, that it work reliably for as long as necessary, without anyone inside the farmhouse knowing it existed. Not luck, not coincidence. Architecture. The architecture of a woman who had decided at some point in the late 1940s that she was going to solve a problem, and had solved it so thoroughly and so quietly that the only person who had seen any of it at all had been an 8-year-old boy standing in the yard next door who thought the trucks were delivering art supplies. Owen sat back down. He looked at the notebook again. Evelyn's prayers, he said quietly. Lord. Cecily drove back to the main house that evening and sat at the kitchen table with the letters arranged in front of her and her laptop open beside them. She had the name of the gallery. She had the initials. She had 15 years of correspondence and a composition notebook with entries precise enough to cross-reference against farm records. What she did not have was external confirmation, a record outside the tower, outside the family, outside the property itself, that placed Evelyn Mercer in the history of art in this region rather than only in the history of this farm. She found the Albany Regional Arts Archive through the State Historical Society website. The contact listed was an archivist named Nadia Croft. Cecily wrote a careful email, the kind she had learned to write over 4 decades of professional correspondence, specific without overreaching factual, without editorializing. She gave the gallery name. She gave the initials and the address. She attached photographs of 3 of the letters the composition notebook cover and the back of the unfinished canvas where Evelyn had written the title in pencil. Then she closed the laptop and went to bed and did not sleep particularly well. Nadia Croft called 2 days later. She called at 8 in the morning, which told Cecily something about how the archivist had spent the intervening 2 days. Her voice was professional and clear, and carried the particular quality of someone who has found something in the records they were not expecting to find and has been waiting for a reasonable hour to discuss it. "I have confirmed the identity," Nadia said. "ELM in the Hatcher and Sons records is Evelyn Louise Mercer of Mercer Hill, Dutchess County. The gallery registered her under that name in their internal records from 1948 onward. The initials were her preference for public attribution. The gallery honored it without question, which was not unusual for the period." Cecily wrote the date at the top of her notebook page and asked what else the records showed. 4 works in institutional collections, Nadia said. 1 at a small museum in the Hudson Valley, I can give you the name. 3 in private collections that were donated to institutions after the original buyers died, so they are documented but not currently accessible to the public. The remaining 10 works from the confirmed sales are unlocated. They may still be in private hands. They may have been sold again without the attribution being tracked. That happens more than people expect with regional artists from this period, particularly women who did not exhibit publicly. Cecily asked about that. About whether Evelyn had exhibited. Never, Nadia said. Not once in 15 years of working with at least 6 galleries. She was asked. I found 2 invitations in the Hatcher records, one for a group show in 1952 and one for a solo feature in 1956. She declined, both without explanation. The gallery accommodated her. There was a brief pause. I found a note from the gallery director, Nadia continued. Written in 1954 in the internal file they kept on each artist. May I read it to you? Cecily said yes. She heard the sound of paper. ELM is our most consistent and least present contact. Work arrives on schedule packed professionally, requires no adjustment on receipt. Payment is accepted by bank draft without complication. She has never attended an opening, never requested to see installation, never asked how her work was received by buyers. In 10 years of correspondence, I have not once seen her handwriting on anything other than a shipping label and a bank draft endorsement. I do not know what she looks like. I know her work extremely well. I consider this one of the more unusual professional relationships I have maintained in 30 years of gallery work, and one of the more straightforward. Nadia stopped reading. Cecily looked at the letters on the table in front of her. Most consistent and least present. The gallery director had spent 30 years in the art world and had arrived at those 2 words to describe Evelyn Mercer and had considered the combination unusual enough to record. He had found it worth noting that a person could be entirely reliable and entirely invisible at the same time. He had not understood it as a strategy. He had understood it as a personality. He had been looking at the result without seeing the architecture behind it. Attending an opening in Albany in 1952 would have meant being seen. Being seen in Albany meant the possibility, not the certainty, but the possibility that someone from Dutchess County might be there. A neighbor, a relative, a friend of Lawrence's who happened to be in the city, someone who would come home and mention it the way people mention things without understanding what they are mentioning. I saw your wife at a gallery opening in Albany. She was being honored for her paintings. One sentence like that said casually at the feed store or over a fence line would have ended 15 years of careful work. Evelyn had calculated the risk and declined the invitation. Twice. Cecily said there is a painting at the Hudson Valley Museum. Has anyone ever inquired about the artist? Nadia said I checked before I called you. The museum acquired it in 1961 from a private buyer who had purchased it through Birchwood Gallery in Saratoga Springs. It is cataloged under the artist name ELM, with a note that the full identity was unknown at time of acquisition. No one has inquired about the attribution in the 60-plus years the museum has held it. It has been in storage for most of that time. The collection is larger than their display space. Cecily wrote this down. A painting in a storage room in the Hudson Valley, cataloged under initials. 60 years without a name attached to it. She started to ask another question, and Nadia said there is one more thing in the records. I want to make sure I read this to you correctly. Cecily waited. Hatcher and Sons kept correspondence files through the end of their operation in 1971, Nadia said. In the 1963 file, the last year before the gallery closed that division, there is a note from ELM. It is brief. It requests the withdrawal of one work from consideration for delivery. The work is described as an upstate landscape oil on linen unfinished, approximately 30 by 40 inches. The note says only, "Please hold, I will advise." She paused. The gallery director added a note beneath it. Nadia said, "I will read it exactly. Artist requests retention. No reason given. Work was never delivered. File closed at end of year." Cecily set her pen down. She looked at the kitchen window. Outside, across the yard, the roofline of the tower was just visible above the barn. Mercer Hill in November. The unfinished canvas. The lower left corner with the underdrawing still showing. Lawrence crossing the far field in 3 inches of paint. Evelyn had contacted the gallery in 1963 and told them not to deliver it. "Please hold, I will advise." She had written those words in the same year she died. She had pulled the painting back from the system she had built and kept it in the room where she had made it, on the easel where it had been made, with the note to Lawrence tucked into the frame beside it. She had not sold it. She had not delivered it. She had kept it. Of all the things Evelyn Mercer had made in 15 years of working in that tower, the one she kept was the unfinished one. The one with his back in the far distance. The one she had covered with linen and left on the easel in the room she knew someone would eventually unlock. If the work Evelyn made for 15 years moved you, the consistency, the invisibility, the care built into every decision this story deserves to find the people who need to hear it. One like is how it travels. Cecily had not gone back through the Bible carefully. She had found the key between pages 23 and 24 of Psalms, and she had stopped there because the key was what she had been looking for, and the key was what she had found. She had not continued. She had been trained to examine evidence systematically, but she had stopped at the thing that answered the immediate question and moved on to the tower. She went back to the Bible that evening. She sat at the kitchen table with the last of the afternoon light coming through the window and opened the Bible from the front and went through it page by page. The family records in the front pages she had already noted: births, marriages, deaths, the entries in different hands across 4 generations. She read through them again more slowly this time and found nothing she had not already seen. She turned pages. The Old Testament. The margins clean, no annotation, no underlining. Lawrence had not been a man who wrote in books. She had known this from the farm ledgers. He recorded facts in the ledgers because the ledgers required it, but he did not add commentary, did not underline things that struck him, did not dog-ear pages. The Bible moved through her hands in the same condition in which it had been kept for decades, used but unmarked. She reached the New Testament. The same, clean margins, no annotation. She reached the back pages, the blank leaves at the end, the ones publishers included as a courtesy in Bibles of that era, plain paper at the back, for whatever a family needed to write down. There was nothing written on them, but between the last 2 blank leaves pressed flat and folded to a small rectangle were 2 pieces of paper. She lifted them out carefully. They were receipts. The paper was old and slightly yellow at the edges, the kind of yellowing that takes decades and happens evenly when paper is kept dry and undisturbed. She unfolded the first one, Hatcher and Sons Fine Art, Albany, New York. The receipt was dated October 1952. It confirmed the sale of a work described as Autumn Hillside Oil on linen signed ELM to a buyer in Troy, New York. The amount was $160. The seller was listed as ELM Mercer Hill. She turned it over. On the back in blue ink in the careful upright print she knew immediately as Lawrence's hand. E's work, Albany, 1952. 3 words and a place and a year. No punctuation, no elaboration. Written in the same deliberate way he wrote everything, pressing the pen with intention, leaving nothing out, adding nothing extra. Cecily set it down and unfolded the second receipt. Same gallery, 1958. A different painting, Winter Morning Dutchess County Oil, on linen 24 by 30 inches, $140. She turned it over. The back was blank. He had written on the first one and not the second. She thought about what that meant. The first time he had written it down, maybe to fix it in place, to acknowledge it to himself, in some private way, to make it real on paper, the way a fact becomes different when you write it. E's work, Albany, 1952, and then 6 years later the second receipt, and he had not needed to write anything because he already knew. The first receipt had been the acknowledgement, the second was simply keeping. He had kept them both. Not destroyed, not confronted, kept, folded and placed between the last pages of his Bible where they would stay until someone went through it carefully enough to find them. Cecily laid the 2 receipts on the table beside the composition notebook and beside the note from the easel. 4 documents, 3 different hands, Hatcher and Sons, Evelyn Lawrence, and between them the complete shape of something that had never been spoken aloud in this house. She read the note from the easel again. I think you know the way you know everything quietly without saying it out loud. Evelyn had been right. Lawrence had found out she did not know when, did not know how. Perhaps a bill of sale seen by accident, perhaps a name recognized at the feed store, perhaps simply the arithmetic of the farm's finances in a year that should not have balanced and did. He had found out and he had not asked. He had not confronted. He had not made her explain herself or justify herself or stop. He had picked up the receipt and written 3 words on the back of it and placed it in his Bible and continued farming and continued saying Evelyn's prayers are working in the good years, saying it in public where anyone could hear, wrapping her income in language that honored it without exposing it. He had protected her system from the outside the same way she had built it to protect itself from the inside. She had kept his pride intact. He had kept her invisible. Neither of them had said a word about any of it to the other or to anyone else for as long as they had both been alive. Cecily thought about her father. Frank had said the tower is too painful to open. He had said it from the time she was 7 until she was 40. He had said it the same way every time, not angry, not warning, just painful, as if the pain were simply a fact of the place that needed to be communicated. Had Frank known? She looked at the receipts. At Lawrence's 3 words on the back of the 1952 receipt. At the Bible that had sat on the study shelf through all of Frank's adult life on this property. Frank had grown up in this house. He had sat in this kitchen. He had used this study. He had perhaps at some point gone through his father's Bible, the way a son goes through a father's things. He might have found the receipts and understood them or found them and not understood them or found them and chosen as Lawrence had chosen not to ask. She thought it was probably the last one. Frank had been his father's son in the specific way of sons who learn their father's habits of silence and adopt them without examination. He had not known the full shape of what was in the tower, but he had known there was a shape. He had felt the weight of it without knowing the contents, and he had protected it the only way he knew how, which was the same way Lawrence had protected it, by saying nothing that would require him to say more. Too painful to open. Not his pain, not Evelyn's pain, not Lawrence's pain, just the pain of a thing that belonged to 2 people who were gone and that a son had understood without being told was not his to open. Cecily sat back in her chair and looked at the 4 documents on the table. She looked at the Bible. She thought about the key. Lawrence had placed it between pages 23 and 24 of Psalms, wrapped in a note that said, "When you are ready." He had placed it there before he died in 1989, which meant he had placed it there knowing Frank would likely be the one to find it. Frank had found it, she felt certain of this now, and had not opened the tower, had put the key back or left it where it was, had continued saying the tower was too painful, had carried the weight of the thing without opening it, because Frank had not been ready, or had not believed it was his to open. Lawrence had known that too. He had known that the right person had not yet arrived, and so he had left the key where it was in the Bible on the shelf, waiting not for the next person who would find it, but for the person who would know what to do with what was inside. Cecily looked out the kitchen window. The tower was visible at the edge of the property in the last of the evening light, pale gray stone against the darker gray of the March sky. The door was closed again. She had pulled it shut behind her when she came down that morning. The padlock left open, looped through the hasp but not locked. She would go back tomorrow. She would go back every day until she understood everything that was there to understand. Lawrence had waited 34 years after Evelyn died before he died himself. He had kept the key the entire time. He had not opened the tower. He had not explained it. He had not told Frank what was inside or what to do about it. He had only placed the key in the Bible with 4 words and trusted that eventually, in the fullness of time, the right person would be the one sitting in this kitchen with these documents on the table and the light going and the tower at the edge of the yard. He had not been waiting for anyone in particular. He had been waiting for someone who was ready. The Hudson Valley Museum of Regional Art was a small institution in a converted mill building 20 miles south of the Mercer Hill property. Cecily had driven past it dozens of times over the years without stopping. She stopped now. The curator was a woman in her 50s named Margaret Poole, who had worked there for 19 years and who had pulled the Evelyn Mercer file before Cecily arrived because Nadia Croft had called ahead. The painting was already out of storage when Cecily walked in. It was leaning against the wall of a small examination room off the main gallery under good light, the way a painting looks when someone has placed it with care for the person who is coming to see it. Cecily stood in the doorway of the examination room and looked at it. It was a winter landscape. The farm from the south a different angle than Mercer Hill in November, the stone walls running at a different axis, the light coming from the left rather than the right. The palette was cooler, bluer, the particular color of upstate New York in January when the snow has settled, and the sky is the same pale gray as the stone walls, and everything in the landscape is held in a stillness that is not emptiness, but rest. The brushwork was confident. The horizon line was held with the same quiet authority she had seen in the unfinished painting in the tower. The same hand, the same eye, the same understanding of how this specific land looked in this specific light. She turned to Margaret Poole and said, "I would like to give you another one." The transfer took 6 weeks. Mercer Hill in November was examined, documented, and cataloged by the museum's registrar. The condition was assessed as exceptional. Given the storage circumstances, the tower's stone walls had maintained a stable temperature and humidity through 60 years, of seasons better than many purpose-built storage environments. The linen was sound. The paint layer was intact. The unfinished corner was noted in the catalog record not as damage but as condition, at time of preservation the painting as Evelyn had left it. The title came from the back of the stretcher in Evelyn's pencil. Mercer Hill in November. The artist attribution was listed in full for the first time in any institutional record, Evelyn Louise Mercer. Born 1919, active 1947 to 1963. Not ELM, her name. The 2 paintings were hung in the same small gallery, the second room off the main entrance, a room with north-facing windows that brought in the same quality of light Evelyn had arranged her easel to receive. Margaret Poole had made that decision without being asked. She had understood. Cecily drove down on the day they were hung and stood in the room and looked at them side by side. She did not stay long. She did not need to. The paintings were complete in themselves. They did not need her presence to be what they were. They had been waiting in 2 different places for 60 years to be in the same room, and now they were, and the room was quiet, and the light was good, and that was sufficient. She drove back to Mercer Hill. The following week she brought the metal box and the composition notebook and the 2 gallery receipts from Lawrence's Bible to the Dutchess County Historical Society. She sat with the archivist for 2 hours and went through everything in order explaining the provenance of each document, the relationship between the letters and the notebook entries, the significance of Lawrence's handwriting on the back of the 1952 receipt. The archivist cataloged everything under a single name, Evelyn Louise Mercer, ELM Mercer, Hill, Dutchess County, active 1947 to 1963. 15 years of documented sales across 6 galleries. Total confirmed revenue $4,280. Applied in full to farm operating expenses, Mercer Hill property. Not farm wife, not hobbyist, not a woman who painted quietly in her spare time. An artist with a documented career and a bookkeeping system that had kept a farm solvent through the lean years after the war. Both things in the same sentence in the same file under the same name. Cecily drove back to the farm in the late afternoon. She parked in the yard and sat in the car for a moment before getting out. She looked at the tower at the eastern edge of the property, pale gray stone in the low March light, the door standing open. She had removed the padlock the morning after she first climbed the stairs, and she had not replaced it. The original mortise lock was still there, the lock that had never been engaged, the lock that had been standing ready to close for 60 years and had never been asked to. She had decided to leave the door open. She had thought about it carefully the way she thought about every decision she made on the property, with the awareness that she was now the person responsible for what happened here, and that the choices she made would be the next layer of the place's history. She had thought about restoration, about renovation, about converting the tower into something usable. She had thought about all of it, and arrived at the same answer each time. Leave it as it is. The easel was still in the upper room, still positioned toward the north window. The unfinished painting had gone to the museum, but she had placed a piece of plain linen over the easel in its absence, folded and draped, the same way Evelyn had draped it because it seemed like the right thing to do with an easel that had held something for 60 years. The brushes were still in their jar, the palette was still on the work table, the cloth still hung on its nail at the first landing. She was not preserving it as a museum, she was leaving it as a room that had been used and remembered how. She got out of the car and walked to the tower and stood at the open door. The smell of linseed oil was fainter now the door had been open for weeks, and the air had moved through the space for the first time in 60 years. But it was still there if you stood at the threshold and paid attention. Still there in the stone, in the wood of the shelves, in the density of the walls that had held everything stable through all those seasons. She did not go in. She stood at the door and looked up the iron staircase, the spiral rising through the center of the tower, toward the light coming down from the upper room, and she thought about Evelyn climbing it. Not once, not occasionally, hundreds of times over 15 years. Up the stairs with the morning's first light brushes cleaned from the day before palette scraped and ready. Down the stairs in the early afternoon to start the evening meal, or to help with something in the yard, or simply because the light had changed and the work was done for the day. Up and down, season after season, year after year, carrying what she was making in both directions, up when she needed the height and the light and the quiet down, when she needed to be in the life that the height and the light and the quiet were helping to sustain. Two kinds of work. One farm, one life built from both of them, held together by two people who had found a way to understand each other without requiring each other to explain. Cecily took out her notebook. She had kept field notebooks her entire professional life. Not journals, not diaries, just records of what she had observed and what she had concluded and what remained to be understood. She had filled hundreds of them over 4 decades. She opened the current one to the next blank page and wrote the date at the top. Then she wrote one line. She was a botanist, too, in her way. She looked at one place for 15 years and painted what she saw change. She capped the pen and looked at the line. A botanist studies a fixed location over time, recording what is stable and what shifts, what persists through seasons and what does not. Evelyn had done the same thing from 40 feet of stone on the eastern edge of this property. She had looked at the same fields, the same walls, the same sky, and the same seasons year after year, and she had understood that fidelity to a place over time was its own kind of knowledge, that staying and looking carefully and recording what you saw was work as serious as any other kind. She closed the notebook. Lawrence Mercer had kept 2 gallery receipts in his Bible for 37 years. He had written 3 words on the back of the first one and nothing on the second because the first was enough. He had called his wife's income her prayers in public and let the word do its work quietly for years. He had locked the tower door from the outside after she died and placed the key between the pages of Psalms and written 4 words on a slip of paper and waited. He had not waited for a particular person. He had waited for whoever would arrive when they were ready. He had trusted that someone in his family would eventually be ready, and that when they were, the tower would still be standing, and the room at the top would still hold what had been left there, and that person would know what to do. He had been right about all of it. Evelyn had known that Lawrence knew. Lawrence had known that Evelyn knew he knew. They had built a life around that shared knowledge without once making it explicit, without ever requiring the other to acknowledge it in words, without diminishing what either of them was doing by naming it directly. They had lived the whole of it in the language they had chosen together. Evelyn's prayers are working. The tower door was open in the late afternoon light. The fields beyond it were still the same fields. The stone walls ran in their slightly irregular lines across the same ground they had always crossed. The ridge at the far edge was the same ridge, the woodline, the same dark mark against the same sky. Some things Cecily thought are preserved not because someone worked to preserve them, but because they were built well enough in the first place, and then left alone by people who understood that the best way to honor a thing is sometimes simply not to disturb it. The house had known the truth for 60 years. It had been waiting for someone to come and be ready to hear it.